Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Hello and welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Anthony Moreno. Recently, the Elections Performance Index from the Election Data and Science Lab at MIT released its evaluation and rankings of how the 2022 midterm elections were administered and carried out across the country. The findings rank New Mexico top in the nation. We now learn more about this with New Mexico's Secretary of State Maggie Toulouse Oliver. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, congratulations on the high ranking. What does this mean for your office and the state of New Mexico?
Well, I'm the lucky one that gets to kind of be the figurehead and speak for the state, but this really truly was a team effort. Not just the work of my incredible staff and our team in the SOS office in Santa Fe, but our state's 33 county clerks, including the incredible Doña Ana County clerk, who works so hard every day to implement a lot of these changes and improvements that we have made over the last several years. And, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't thank our legislature for being incredibly supportive of a lot of the efforts that have gone into gaining us this high ranking, and of course the governor for signing legislation into law. So what this means is we have a lot to be proud of as a state, and we have a lot of shared credit to go around.
Can you share a little bit more about what sort of changes were made leading up to the 2022 election that you think may have enabled this high ranking?
Sure. Well, for better or worse, we had some incredible lessons learned during 2020, aka the COVID election. Around the country, my colleagues and I and our colleagues in local election offices were scrambling to figure out how to preserve our democracy with a global pandemic and ensure that even more than ever, because it was so important to have voices heard, that we were enabling access to the ballot box. So there was a lot of actual innovation going on during 2020 that maybe would not have happened here in New Mexico. We made some changes as well, some tweaks to processes that really improved things like absentee balloting. For example, we started installing secure monitored containers across the state for folks to drop off their ballots. So there were questions about whether United States Postal Service was delivering mail on time and things like that. So we said, here's a way to get it directly to your county clerk without having to walk inside a building, for example. The online tools that we have available through the Secretary of State's office that every single county has access to and that every single voter in the state have access to, we've continued to develop those. You can do almost everything you want to do as a voter online except vote. For that we rely on the low-tech paper ballot. But to register, to ask for an absentee ballot, to track your ballot, to find out where to vote, to get your sample ballot, you can do everything else online. You can register online, importantly. That is a piece that this ranking was looking at. We make it super simple. If you have a current or even expired New Mexico driver's license or state ID to get registered online. So there are a lot of these improvements that were made, I think, sort of by virtue of COVID. And now, I'm excited to see 2 years from now how things look since we implemented the New Mexico Voting Rights Act last year.
I definitely want to talk with you more about that. But first, I'd like to hear why election officials like yourself across the country value this index. What are some things that you really pay attention to with this?
We value it because it is looking at election administration rather than, the value of policies. So much about our elections is unfortunately caught up in, partisanship and the toxicity that we're experiencing as Americans right now around differing opinions on what types of policies are right and wrong for voting. This particular ranking, it takes some policies into consideration, but what it's really looking at is how well are you executing? How many voters are you getting registered? What are the pathways that you're providing? What are the tools that you're providing? What are your error rates? When you mail out a ballot to a voter and you get that ballot back, is it getting counted, right? So that's why election administrators really pay attention to this ranking, because, it does put the politics aside and it really is looking at the execution. If you think about, watching the Olympics, if you think about ice skating, there's the creative score and the technical score, right? And the creative score is sort of how, beautiful was the, was the performance, and, was it artistic? But the technical score is about, did the jumps get nailed? Did they land? And that's what this particular ranking is focusing on.
How important is electronic registration today in our elections?
It's absolutely vital, because that's the world we're living in. You and I, and probably most of the folks watching, we do our banking online, pay our bills online. Most of, how we sort of get through the daily chores of life. I'm incredibly busy and I'm traveling a lot. So I order my groceries online, to have them delivered to my house a lot of the time. So we have to have that option available. And then in addition to, being able to access your voter information and get registered and update, we also need to be able to share our data with other states. There's not a federal government mechanism to do that. So we created a mechanism among ourselves, the member states, to share that data to make sure our voter lists are as clean as possible as well.
What about access to resources when it comes to voting? So potential voters or people who are voting understand where they need to be and have all the resources and information they need possible. How important is that to your office?
It's absolutely critical for two reasons. First of all, for the voter, right? Because there are options now, and because there are different ways to cast your ballot, making sure that the voter has a centralized access point to find that information. Do I want a ballot mailed to me, which is totally allowable in the state of New Mexico for whatever reason, or do I want to go in person? And if I go in person, do I want to go early or on election day? Where can I go? What hours are they open? What do I need when I walk in that voting location in order to cast my ballot? You're not having to figure out 33 different ways of accessing that information for 33 different counties. You have it in one fell swoop, right in one location. And from an administrative point of view, for those of us that are running elections, it's incredibly helpful too, because in the past, our offices, and when I started running elections back in Bernalillo County, in the late 2000s, our offices were inundated with phone calls. Where do I go vote? When is the voting open? When is early voting open? What's the nearest location to me? And my staff would be looking up addresses and looking up the closest locations, kind of like a little factory of voter information elves. And now it is just easily accessible 1, 2, 3 on the internet.
What were some of the takeaways from the 2022 election that your office learned about and has taken steps to implement for this year's election?
So I always say the sort of beautiful thing and the challenge of elections is there's always room for improvement. There's no such thing as a perfect election. If you think about it, we are literally thousands, hundreds of thousands of human beings managing elections in this country. And in our communities, most of the folks that you encounter or that I encounter when we walk into a polling place are single day or maybe a couple week-long volunteers that have given up their time and become trained to make sure that we can cast our ballots. So I think we always have something to gain from an election cycle that we can do better and differently and make it more streamlined. And of course, again, we're looking at those two sides of the coin. We're looking at what makes this better for the voter and what makes this better for us as election administrators. Not just selfishly because as election administrators, we maybe want less work to do or something like that, but because we want elections to be efficient, smoothly run, professional, and because we want to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars, right? It could be really easy to throw money at a lot of problems and still not gain efficiency. So in 2002, again, every election has its own flavor. A few of the things that we learned were, again, how to better do vote by mail. More folks are opting for that. We now have in New Mexico since last year a permanent option to always receive your ballot through the mail if you so request it. So how are we going to make sure that those permanent vote-at-home voters are able to, do their single sign-up and get their ballot every single election and make sure that that process is smooth? And physically speaking, how are we going to make sure that voters continue to move through? We got a great data point from 2002 that the average wait time in person for a New Mexico voter was 3.8 minutes, so less than 4 minutes. The national average is 5. We're under that average. And so we also learned a bunch of things about how to continue doing that well. So if you're an in-person voter, you're having the best experience possible.
What do you think are some of the key moves that have been implemented to really ensure that the average voting time is under 4 minutes?
So two things. First of all, again, really embracing here in New Mexico the culture of vote by mail. The more people that are voting from the comfort and convenience of their homes, the fewer people there are at the polls. I have become a permanent vote by mail voter. I love voting at home with my, breakfast and coffee and downloading my sample ballot and being able to look at maybe a League of Women Voters guide about the candidates. So I think that piece of the equation is it's reducing, the physical pressure on early and election day polling locations. And then, in terms of physical in-person voting, we have robust early voting in New Mexico. We look at some other states where early voting is getting rolled back. There's not that many options for it. Sort of the conventional wisdom is that maybe 10 days of early voting, for every state is preferable. Well, we have 28 here in New Mexico if you count voting in person at the clerk's office for the first 2 weeks. So that makes it better. And then the fact that we have vote centers, it doesn't matter where you live in your county, you can vote at any polling location that's open on your county, whether it be during early voting or on election day. And that just makes the process so much easier for voters and smoother in person.
Election security, of course, a big topic. And when we do have election years, how do you think New Mexico's infrastructure is right now in order to ensure we can continue to deliver secure elections?
New Mexico very early embraced the tools and resources at our disposal from the federal government. Once elections were declared national critical infrastructure by the Department of Homeland Security very, very early in my first term as Secretary of State, we said we totally agree. And we became very close partners with the Department of Homeland Security and in particular CISA, the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. We utilize those federal tools to make sure our systems are, solid, and where there are vulnerabilities that we are able to patch those and make sure that they are secure. We get intelligence updates on sort of, the activities of particularly not rogue nations, but nations that are out there trying to influence, the outcome of American elections, or even just rogue individuals who are out there trying to do that kind of activity, how to thwart those activities and ensure that our systems are safe. And now I think more than ever, unfortunately, we're very concerned about the physical safety and security of our polling locations, our central voting warehouses, courthouses and facilities where our election administrators work every day. So we're taking advantage of not only, again, those federal resources, but working together with our local law enforcement partners, our state police, our county sheriffs, and local police, as well as a variety of other trainings and efforts to ensure that security.
Has threats against election officials like yourself and others across the state impacted staffing or in any ways? Can you talk about that a little bit with us?
I don't know what it is about New Mexico. I think we're a bunch of tough cookies out here in the West. I don't know of anybody that has, either, moved on from being a local election administrator or poll worker, out of concerns of physical safety. I think really what it comes down to is the folks in this state. Two things are yeah, of course we're tough cookies, right? But are confident in the tools and resources that we have in place to ensure our physical safety. And we're also extremely dedicated to our democracy and ensuring that every single voice is heard. And that's on both sides of the aisle, Democratic and Republican. Like every other state, there are some people that have decided to move on, particularly folks who've been working the polls year after year. I think COVID maybe had more to do with that here in our state than anything else. And so it is still a challenge. We do need folks to come out and work the polls. We especially need that younger generation, because if we are going to sustain a citizen-run election system in this country and in this state, we need folks to come in early. You can even start working the polls when you're 16 years old here in New Mexico, and we love those intergenerational partnerships with young folks and older folks working the polls. That's where we, here in our state anyway, are seeing a particular need.
What sort of dedication does somebody need to prepare for if they want to work at a poll?
Well, you just need to care about democracy and want to be part of it. There's a training prior to, if you're going to work on election day or even the early voting period, there's a training prior to. It's a few hours out of your life to sort of understand the basics of how the election runs. You'll get on-the-job training there, usually with an experienced presiding judge, somebody who's in charge of the polling location, who's been doing this year after year. It's a long day. The polls are open for 12 hours on election day, but we expect you to get there a little earlier and stay until everything's done at the end of the night. So, one long day out of your life and a little bit of training to basically help ensure that every single New Mexican gets their voices heard. That's all we ask.
I want to bring up something that happened recently. The National Association of Secretaries of State called on Congress to provide more funding to address cybersecurity threats. Can you share a little bit about why more federal funding is needed to address this issue?
Sure. Well, as we were talking about before, it's really important to note that a lot of the cybersecurity threats that we're experiencing are coming from foreign nations, right? Governments like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, they're targeting government systems at all levels, but they're especially interested in our election systems. And it's really, I think, logical to understand that when we are trying to combat a foreign threat, that's not something that we as individual states should be trying to do all on our own. We do need those federal government resources in order to combat that foreign threat. And as I mentioned before, of course, we do have that incredibly robust partnership with DHS and CISA and other FBI, DOJ, other federal agencies. But the funding is needed to be able to shore up the systems here in our state, not just my system at the SOS office in Santa Fe, but the 33 county clerk systems around the state, to ensure that they have protection and tools and resources at that local county level. Because if you think about it, elections are, it's a big chain. And like anything else, the weakest link in the chain means that the chain doesn't do its job, right? So we need to protect every single link in that chain here in our state. When we have that consistent federal funding, when we know it's coming year after year, even if it's a smaller amount, we can count on that, we can budget it, and we can make plans for these types of programs that we need. New
Mexico lawmakers have taken steps to address just how strong our elections are in the state. You mentioned this earlier about lawmakers passing the Voting Act in New Mexico. Can you share a little bit about that and just how big of an impact it's had?
Sure. Well, as this election performance index ranking noted, we were already doing a really good job here in New Mexico as of 2022. And again, I just want to emphasize how awesome it is to be at the top of a good list here in our state. We're so often feeling at the bottom of the good list and the top of the bad list. So New Mexico legislature and the governor decided, we're going to up the ante even further and increase both security and access even more. So we did things like creating that permanent absentee list that I mentioned a little earlier, so you can always get your ballot in the mail if you want that. We created the Native American Voting Rights Act carve out here in New Mexico to allow our sovereign tribes and pueblos the ability to have much more decision-making capacity with what is right for their communities, including whether or not they want to designate their tribal government buildings for receipt of absentee ballots and for ballot drop-off stations, those secured monitored containers we talked about, to provide for their extremely rural communities with difficult mail delivery service. We're getting ready to roll out as of next summer the automatic voter registration provision, which will ensure that every single New Mexico voter is automatically registered to vote. And if they choose not to be, they can opt out. That is totally every American and every New Mexican's option, but you won't basically have to do a thing in order to be registered. So those are some things that I'm excited about and one thing to look forward to in the coming years.
In the most recent legislative session in New Mexico, lawmakers also took steps to address the New Mexico Election Fund. Can you share with us a little bit about this fund and how it plays a role in our elections?
Sure. So bottom line is, my office and we fund the county clerks for their election expenses. So when they're securing a polling location or printing a ballot or hiring a poll worker, that the funding for that comes through our office. And year after year, it's been a bit of a system that has not worked. Let's just say that, in terms of how we've been inconsistently funded from the New Mexico legislature. So over the years, we've made our case to receive a designated funding stream that we always know that funding is going to be there, a minimum amount that we can, sort of for the average election, be able to depend on to fund those election costs that we can always anticipate. And so it's no longer a mystery. We don't have to go to the legislature every year with our hat in hand, but rather we know that funding is there moving forward, and that's going to be a huge improvement for all of us.
Lawmakers also took steps to address artificial intelligence disclosures. Can you tell us a little bit about how that may play a role?
Well, this year is going to be really probably the first election year in which we're going to see a lot of artificial intelligence generated content in our sort of what we're consuming in terms of election information, whether it be political ads, social media posts, that type of thing. So the legislature, in its wisdom, decided to ensure that there's a disclosure. So if you are using generative AI, in other words, if you're using AI or artificial intelligence to create either language or an image, a voice, a video, that has to be disclosed to the public, so we know whether what we're consuming is the real deal or whether it's something that a computer made up. And I think that's going to be really critical in this election cycle and beyond.
Lawmakers also took steps to address firearms near polling places. Can you tell us about this and how you think it can make an impact for those folks going to the polls?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's sort of a no-brainer, and even states like Texas already do not allow firearms in polling locations. There are other locations around the state that already are prohibited, like schools, for firearms to be present. So it just sort of made the next step of logical sense to prevent firearms from being carried, in a polling location. potentially intimidating individuals, making them feel fear, concern, potentially discouraging them from casting a ballot, right? In this, again, incredibly polarized political climate we're in, people are afraid, and we want to make sure that they feel safe at the polls. So I'm happy that this legislation passed.
I have only 30 seconds left with you, but I want to ask you, there's been some turnover at the U.S. Election Commission with the executive director position. What are your concerns about that?
You know, I think the good news is that we have had a really strong quorum of 4 election assistance commissioners who are very experienced and know their jobs. So the EAC is continuing to do what they need to do. We'll hopefully have a good long-term administrator in there moving forward.
All right, Secretary of State Maggie Toulouse Oliver, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week's program. Remember, you can always keep updated with the latest news at krwg.org, where you can also submit questions you have about voting in New Mexico, or any questions you have for candidates running in this year's election. Your questions at krwg.org can help drive our election coverage this year. We look forward to hearing from you. For all of us at KRWG Public Media, I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.